Hi everyone, it's Gigabeef here, and today we're going to be going through the next set of weapons that you can get in the early wipe, and this is going to be going from basically level 15 to level 19. I already did a video going from level 1 up to level 14 just before you get to the flea market with the basic things that you can buy from traders, so go and watch that if you haven't already and you need that. But this is going to effectively start to look at level 2 traders, except for Mechanic because he's at level 20 and there's quite a big jump from level 15 to level 20 in terms of XP. So what can we get access to at level 15? Well, if we jump in, we can see Prapor, Skier, Peacekeeper and Jaeger are all at level 2. Mechanic is a bit higher, as I said, and I'm not quite there yet myself, but this will do for the next kind of 4 levels between you getting the flea market and getting to level 19 just before we get to Mechanic. And we're going to jump into Prapor first because he's the obvious choice and he's right at the start. So we're going to look at weapons and we're going to look at Prapor's level 2 selection. So it might become immediately obvious that there's a lot of AKs here to start with, and there's 4 cash purchases which are all kind of the same. So you have the AK-74N here, you have the AKS-74UN, we have the AKS-74N there, and the AK-74. Now these are all very slightly different. They're all around the same price, so about 35k, which gets you a brand new one. Depending on how precious you are, sometimes these can just be bought cheaper on the flea market, but they're at much lower durability. So if you're fighting close range and you're not doing that much full auto, then maybe it's just cheaper to buy one on the flea market. But from Prapor himself, these ones are all kind of similar. I would personally go for either the AK-74N or the AKS-74N because we're not really going to be modifying the stock, so it doesn't really matter which one you choose between these two. But the N version gives you a dovetail rail, which you can see on the side, and this gives you extra mounting opportunities and means that you don't need to buy a bastion to mount a scope, depending on exactly what kind of scope you are looking for. And the Barters are usually quite similar. This is a 74N, just in a different colouring. You need to be able to buy these Apollos for 7,000, obviously, otherwise it ends up being more expensive, which can or cannot happen, it just sort of depends. 74UB can be worth it at times. They've continued to add. This used to just be a cat ages ago, but now it's the cat, it's 2 USBs, and it's a Marlboro as well. Or buy one of these 74Us here from Prapor directly for cash, and then just to buy the suppressor separately if you want to do that. This is usually the better way to do it. And finally, we have the Plum one as well. Again, it's very similar to the others. This can work because toilet paper and toothpaste can be quite cheap, so again you can get this one kind of cheap as well. It's nice that all the stuff from the traders comes at 100 durability, which means that you're always going to be getting a nice new weapon. Again, if you don't need that, you can go to the flea, but if you do want that, then sometimes these barter items, if you're watching out for it, can end up being quite cheap and you can get a weapon fairly easily if you're using 545 ammo. Now the other AKs that he has available is the AKm and the AKms. Now the AKm is typically better than the AKms because the AKm stock can be replaced. The AKms has this fixed kind of wireframe stock which can't be replaced. The only thing that it can have is the butt pad on, which all the other AKs can have. By the way, that's actually quite an important point because Prapor 2 unlocks the use of the butt pad within AK weapons. It means you don't have to try and buy that on the flea, and you can go and grab this here, and it's only 4,000 rubles, and it's really good actually, minus 5% recoil and plus 2 ergonomics, so just bear that in mind. But switching back to weapons, these two are honestly too expensive. There's really no need to ever buy an AKm or an AKms from Prapor, and that's because of one of the level 1 trades. If you go back to the level 1 barters, the AKm here, you can trade that in for 3 Tushonkas, and on the flea market, the Tushonkas are around 10,000. So you always end up getting your AKms, and this is the better one as well. You end up getting that for about 30 to 35,000, which is cheaper than what you'll get from him in cash. Outside of the AKs, there's another few weapons as well. There's the Grotch, which is 13,800. This is very similar to a lot of the other pistols like the M9. It's really personal preference as to which one you like. This is very, very similar because it also fires 9x19. It doesn't fire 9x18 like some of the others, and it has 18 rounds in its magazine. So between this, the Glock, and the M9A3, it's really up to you as to which one you prefer. Nothing too special here. Next up is the Shrimp, or the SR1MP. This is actually really quite underrated because Kite gunpowder is very cheap. It's normally around 10,000 rubles, and this is actually probably one of the best pistols in the entire game. Again, 18 rounds, but the thing about this gun is that the ballistics for it really work out in your favour. Now, as of the recording of this video, none of these rounds are actually banned on the flea market as of yet. However, you can buy P rounds from Prapor, which are not that great, but 164 rubles a round, and that's 65 damage, which is a lot, and 18 pen, which is very mediocre, which will stand you in good stead as far as pistols go when you're aiming for headshots. However, there are some other alternatives. There is PS here, so you can see there is some on the fleet. The liquidity is very, very thin for it, which is kind of a shame, and it is only at loyalty level 3 with Prapor that you can actually buy this stuff at 153. But this stuff, if you can get your hands on a bit of it, it's 49 damage and 35 pen, which is outrageous for the early wipe stage. Given you're not going to be firing that much of it, then maybe it's worth picking up a few and just mixing your mags and seeing how you go. The other one that's really good is BT, which is 63 damage and 39 pen. As you can see, there's none that are on the Flea at the moment as well, which is a real shame. But if you find any of this ammo, or you do actually see some on the Flea and you want to run it, then it's a potential option, just because this pistol can potentially be one of the most powerful pistols in the entire game if you have the right ammo in it. Next one, we're going to jump all the way down to here, and this is to the APS pistol. Now, the interesting thing about this guy is that this can actually be fire mode changed over into full auto. The recoil on this means that it's probably not recommended. I did try one wipe to complete stirrup with this, and it was very mixed in terms of its effectiveness, but at least it's an option. You know, you have 20 rounds in there and you can spray at people. Now, it only uses 9x18, which is a little bit of a shame, but there are some ways to make this work. So kind of the standard ammo that you're going to be buying for this weapon is PMPST, which is this one here. And this is 50 rubles from Prapor, which is extremely cheap. And this has 50 damage and 12 pen. Now, there's a few other options that are better. There's PMMPST, which is kind of an interesting one. This is 58 damage and 24 pen. As you can see, it's actually fairly plentiful, so you can get this if you want. 24 pen is all right, but it's not amazing. The other one is PBM, which is this one here. And this is 40 damage and 28 pen. So you're actually getting towards like an actually decent pen here. But this is more like 600, 700 around. But you know what? It's a choice. You can use it if you want to, and it is potentially a way to make this weapon work, along with all the other 9x18s. So note, you can also craft PBM in the workbench level 2 if you've got that far. Right, so the next one, we're going to stay within 9x18, and this is the Ketter. Now, for a suppressed submachine gun, 36,000 rubles is actually pretty cheap, and it's got not that bad stats to begin with. It's 50 recoil, which is not too terrible, and the ergonomics is 52, but the gun handles not too terribly, honestly, and you get it suppressed for a really, really low price. This is actually pretty decent. Now, the one thing that you have to remember about the Ketter is that we just talked about the two different types of rounds. PSTM does not work in the Ketter. This only works in the Clin, which is the next weapon. And because it's an overpressure round, which means that it only works in weapons that it was designed for, which is this basically. Now, this one comes unsuppressed, and this is 23,000 rubles, a bit cheaper because it doesn't have the suppressor, but it can use that ammo that we were just talking about, the PMMPST. Both can still use PBM, so that's still a potential option, but these are actually not bad submachine guns to use, especially if you're just looking for headshots. You can also buy the 30 round mags from Prapor, so there's no real issues with magazines or anything with this gun, so it is quite usable in that sense. Next one is on to an old fan favourite, the PP19. Now, at 21,000 rubles, this is actually really quite cost effective. This functions in Tarkov like the equivalent MP5, the bear really, and I think it's an underrated weapon given the recoil changes that we've had, because the fire rate at 700 RPM is lower than the MP5 at 800, but because we're not modding this stuff like crazy, that lower RPM actually ends up working in its favour like some of the other weapons to give you lower recoil, because recoil's kind of been increased across the board, and so some stock weapons like the MP5 that used to feel really good don't feel quite as good anymore. Because it also similarly follows AK patterns of kind of manufacturing design, it benefits from those things too. So you can get the rubber butt pad for the stock, it has a dovetail mount for using scopes or close range optics like the EKP, the magazines are super cheap, you can change over the handguard over to the AK100 so you can put a foregrip on it. The options are endless, whereas looking at the MP5, it's actually very difficult, we'll come on to that later. This thing's never going to be busting through armor like all the 9x19s, but it's definitely a possible suggestion in terms of something to run, again if you're looking for headshots. Now the next one, onto the SV98. I think that this barter is probably cheaper than what you're going to get on the flea market. 5 Apollos and 3 Marlboros ends up costing about 80,000. When you go on the flea, almost all of these, because this is a gun that spawns on scavs, really none of these until you get to about this point here are actually 100 durability, which is what you're looking for with a bolty. I'm not sure why you'd run this weapon otherwise. If you just want to kind of point blank people, you may as well just buy a Mosin that doesn't have a scope on it, and that would be a lot cheaper. For example, this one right here. And this is the other weapon that we have available to us at this point. The interesting thing about the Mosin and the SV98 is that there really are not that many weapons that use 7.62 54R, SVD being the other one. And so if you want to be using that round, you really have to be using one of these 3 guns. The Mosin or its other counterparts that don't have the sniper ability to add a scope, because this can add the PU on it on the side and some other potential mods, or the SV98 and the SVD. Now, I'm not really using bolties at the moment, and when I am, I'm using the VPO from Jaeger, but if you were looking at using the Mosin, then potentially you could go and grab this. I really wouldn't be buying the SV98 at this point using the Prapor barter. I just think 80k at this stage is too expensive to be paying for a bolt action weapon, but you absolutely can do if you want to. I think the Mosin is probably a better choice. Alright, let's move on to the next trader, which is Skier. So let's bring up his weapons as well and start off with the MCX Barter. This doesn't make any sense at all at the moment because GPXs are going for an insane price, so don't do this barter. However, MCXs themselves are going on the flea market for something that is not too crazy. The issue at the moment though is that you can't really buy the good ammo. The best ammo that you can get at the moment is BCP FMJ, which is 60 damage, which is pretty decent, and 29 pen, which is not really that decent. So that's kind of the problem here, and given that we're not really going to be looking at modding this stuff a load, so I haven't even identified some of these parts, it's 84 recoil to start with. I think it's just a little bit too much with the recoil changes unless you're going to seriously spend some money on it, which is hard to do when you don't have the trader levels. Next up we have the RFB, and I think this is going to be the start of the early mid-game if I'm honest. This fires M80, which is sold out frequently at Peacekeeper, so keep an eye out for him to actually try and buy some of that stuff, because M80 busts through level 4 armor with over a 90% chance to pen, which is the reason why this gun is going to be so insane. You can buy 20 round magazines from Peacekeeper, actually, it's not from Skier, but you can buy this from him for 55,000, which I actually think is quite a fair price. If you look on the flea market, they're not going for any less than that. I think this is actually a really decent gun. It has a scope mount automatically on it, and you can also put a foregrip on to increase the ergonomics if you want, and because it's a bullpup, it actually has quite decent ergo to begin with. It's a shame that this scope is so far forwards. I don't really like scopes being so far forwards just from the way they feel to me, but if you're wanting to slug some M80s, this is a gun that will absolutely do that, and it was great last wipe, and now that it's still in the game in its position that it's in within the traders, I think it's still going to be great this wipe too. Next is the M870 Remington shotgun. It's another pump shotgun. To be honest, nothing really to see here. I don't really see what's so great about this. Some people like it, but I'm not a huge user of it, so we're just going to move on to the next one, which is the APC Vector. Now this is quite interesting. I think this is probably a bit too expensive, 90,000 here. However, you can buy them on the flea market for 50k. Again, 100% durability because they don't really spawn on scavs, they only spawn in weapons boxes, which is where these have come from. So it's kind of cool that you can get access to the Vector so early. The main problem though is that you can only get tiny little magazines for it, which really is quite problematic. I was hoping that this one would have one inside, but it doesn't. This is really the only thing you can get, which is the 13 round mag, and given that this guy has 1100 RPM, you're going to run out of bullets almost instantaneously. Also, you run into a problem of not being able to buy the good ammo for this stuff. You really want to be either using the really damaging flesh rounds, or you want to be using the AP ammo, neither of which you have access to. So you have access to Match FMJ with 76 damage and 25 pen, which is actually alright, and that's 100 rubles each, or Hydra Shock, which is more leggy, which is 105 damage, but that's quite thin on the flea market and you can't buy that at all. Laser Match you can buy, that's 80 damage and 19 pen for 105 rubles, which again is okay, but I think I'd probably just go for Match, given it has 4 less damage, but it has 6 more pen, means that you're going to be able to bust slightly easier through level 3 armor. Level 4 it's still going to be a problem though, and with 13 rounds I think that's why this weapon is probably not really a goer just yet before you can buy those. Finally, we've got the STM9. This is basically a glorified Saiga 9. I don't really advise using this. It's semi-auto and 9x19. I just think there are better choices. It can be quite fun, but outside of fun, I don't think it's meta in any sense. It's probably one of the worst guns in the entire game, just in terms of utility. Okay, now we're done with Skier, let's move over to Peacekeeper. The interesting thing about Peacekeeper, so I said this guide was for level 15 to 19. Well, Peacekeeper you can actually get access to at level 14. You don't need to be level 15 to get him. So you can have Peacekeeper 2 before you get the flea market. And there is no rep requirements, you don't need to do any quests for him or anything, it's just money spent. So work on spending your money and you can get him at level 14, one level earlier than the flea. Unfortunately, I don't really like his weapon selection that much. The first one is the classic M4A1, the default loadout that you get in Tarkov, $771 US, which costs 96,000 rubles in our Russian money. And I think this is just way too much. If you go and look at the flea market, you can already buy these for cheaper than that at 65k. But personally, what I would do, and this is always the way that I build my stuff, anyone who's been watching my videos for a while will know that, probably know what's coming even. If you take away operational only, you can buy these lowers for the Colt M4. You can try and buy one 86 out of 94. It's not actually too bad. You can buy that for 35,000 rubles. And then what you do is you go and buy an ADAR, and those cost around 20k. So if you can swap that over onto the M4, that's then cost you 55,000 and you get an M4, which is taking all the parts from the ADAR. And the important part about this is that a stock ADAR has 60 ergo and 91 recoil. When you go to the M4 that Peacekeeper sells, It's got 52 ergo and 90 recoil, so they're actually very, very similar. So transferring all the parts over, yes, I know people don't really like the barrel as much. The 370mm barrel has a better MOA on it and that kind of thing. But it's, unless you're looking for sniping with this stuff, it doesn't really matter. Like I build most of my M4s this way. That's just the best way to do it, in my opinion. It becomes a lot better once you have Mechanic 2 open, because then you can buy the lowers from him directly, and then it becomes a complete no-brainer. So buying one of these off the fleet, it only really works if the lowers are cheap, but usually there are some people selling lowers that are not terrible. They're not like 50 durability, they're more like 90, and it's not too bad. It's doable. So I think that's better than trying to buy them from him directly here. Couple more pistols, P226R, USP .45, and the M1911. This is kind of cool because although this guy is 9x19, so yes, yet another Parabellum pistol, we have the USP in .45 and the M1911 also in .45. This again comes down to personal preference. You can use ACP match with 25 pen in there. It's a bit better than 9x19 PST, which is the one that you're going to be using pretty much in all of these others. So it's really just personal preference, more pistols. Next, onto the SCARL. At $897, this costs nearly 110,000 rubles. This is way too much. You can see on the flea market they're going for about 60k. This is kind of equivalent to the base M4. It has 82 vertical recoil as standard, which is okay. It also has a mount for putting a foregrip on already, which is decent, and also a scope. So it's kind of better than the original M4 to begin with. Probably just buy one of these rather than buying an M4 if you were really going to go and do that. However, I'm still not sure about this quite a lot, and you can only fire M855 early game anyway, and so I think it's probably just a bit of a waste of money. Now, the MPX at $390, that's 49,000 rubles. Now, this weapon can get to a very low recoil, as we've seen in previous patches, and you can throw on a few different mods. You can just add a foregrip or something and change the stock over. That can be quite cheap, but at 43 recoil, it's actually pretty decent out of the box. Problem with this is because it's running, again, 9x19, so you're going to have to be hitting headshots, but you can put an optic straight on, and that's actually quite good given what you get for it. The magazines are also not too bad. You can go and buy a larger capacity one on the flea market if you want, because people are selling those for not an insane amount, and it's actually alright. It's an okay weapon if you want to run an SMG that has a lot of modability and the ability to add attachments straight out of the box natively. The MPX is in contrast to the MP5. Now, the issue that I find with the MP5, I used to really like this weapon because you got given it as a PMC when you chose USEC within your stash, and this was really good early wipe. But with the recoil changes, I've super fallen out with the MP5 in terms of its performance. With 48 vertical recoil, I just don't think it's that amazing anymore. It just doesn't feel it to me anyway. It's not too bad, but the magazines are kind of expensive. You can't mod it at all. You need to buy a mount, which is always sold out from Peacekeeper at the start of the wipe. You can't even buy the handguard, so you can't put a vertical foregrip on it. And the problem is, once you've bought the mount, it actually costs like $80 or something, which ends up being about 10k. And for that extra increase in money, you may as well just go and buy the MPX. Like, I really don't think there's a place for the MP5 anymore. It's very, very difficult to justify. Another side note, the MP5 SD, by the way, which gets unlocked at Peacekeeper 2 through a quest, Scrap Metal, which I haven't completed, is potentially justifiable because the recoil on that thing is so much lower. I don't have it unlocked, so I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's somewhere around 30 to 35, which is pretty insane. And if you buy it as a whole package from him, then I believe it's about 60 to 70k, which yes is expensive, but it's one of the lowest recoil weapons that you can get early game. And I really quite like that weapon. I think I'm a little bit biased because I've loved running that weapon in earlier wipes, but that's one to watch out for. But I think the actual base MP5, I just don't think it's worth it over the MPX. Right, final two, onto the MP9 at $246. That's more like 31,000, which is actually pretty cheap. This has 900 RPM, which is very high, with 57 recoil, so you're not going to be fighting over long or medium distance with this weapon, again with 9x19, but at point blank, it's going to actually work quite well. A little run and gun, and it's got very high ergo, so you can ADS super quick with it. You can only buy 20 round mags until Peacekeeper 3, which is the main problem. However, rather than buying the MP9, I don't really know why these weapons are so expensive here and at Peacekeeper himself, because if you go for the MP9N, which is the alternative equivalent version, and it's very similar, except this one has 55 recoil, but with 1100 RPM instead. Now, I think this is probably just a better weapon given what you're going to be using it for, which is up close, pressing it into somebody and just firing as many rounds towards their head as possible. But This gives you another one to consider, and it's a potential. Interestingly, there are only 100% versions on here, which means again they don't spawn on scavs, so you don't really get them on raiders. They're all coming out of weapons crates, so you know you're not going to have to worry about durability, which is another thing going for the MP9N. And last but not least, the UMP45. This is a new-ish weapon that was added to the game in the last patch, and people didn't really use it that much because it was added quite late into the wipe, and so with its 600 RPM, it just didn't really perform very well compared to the other weapons. However, because of the aforementioned recoil changes, I think this is actually a contender, given the recoil is lower on this, partly because it's of its RPM, and it's 53 recoil as a base, so it's not too bad. You can mount a scope on it natively, and you can also mount a vertical foregrip on it natively. We can't get the suppressor yet because it's kind of too early, unless you're going to spend a lot of money on the flea market, but as a gun in and of itself, it's actually pretty good. The magazines are also very, very cheap. Now there's one cheap way of getting this. So a lot of people are aware of the Barter. There's 7 of these black handled knives that you can get on Peacekeeper. These are usually rarer than the brown handled versions, but what you can do is you can go to fence, you can go into weapons, and you can go into melee weapons, and you can go and see that he does actually have some available for the brown ones, and sometimes he has them available also for the black ones as well, with people selling them to him. I think more and more people are catching up on this trick as well, because you can buy them for about 4,500 rubles, which means that you end up actually getting them for cheaper than you can get as the cash trade, which is quite interesting. So it ends up being cheaper than this 274, which is about 34,000. But that's an interesting one to watch out for. Otherwise, maybe just save these up and you can use the UMP, and you can use the match ATP like we talked about for the other .45 weapons, and it's a bit better than 919 Parabellum in the PST rounds. So this is another strong contender. I think this is actually quite good early wipe, to be honest with you. Okay, so on to the final trader that we're going to look at before we move on to flea market and a few other notes. So looking at his weapons, I think this is going to be fairly fast. We have the Vepr Hunter for 48,000 rubles. Just buy the RFB. There's really no point in buying the Vepr Hunter anymore. It used to be fine before durability kicked in, but now 48,000 to get a new one is extremely expensive to run, and given that it has 5-round mags, you can get 20-round mags for the RFB and it fires the same rounds, and it's only 7,000 more. I really think that the RFB is a lot better of a weapon than the Vepr Hunter, and this was only great before because you could get it so cheaply compared to the RFB, but now it just isn't really a thing. You know, if you're going to go and have a look here, all of these guys have got terrible durability. Yes, they're very, very cheap, but it just, if you're going to be using the Hunter for what it's for, you're going to be firing over a decent distance, unless you're fighting with somebody at really point blank, at which point 5 rounds in a magazine, I just also don't think is going to cut it. It used to have a lot more variability on it because you could fight at close or long range. Now, the crappy ones on the fleet can only be really used at short, and buying a full one from Jaeger doesn't make sense when the RFB exists. Next up, we have the MP155. This handles very similarly to the 153, which we can also buy here for about 30 and 35,000 rubles. Again, more semi-automatic shotguns. We also have the Saiga 12, which we can buy for 25,000, which is a bit cheaper. I quite like the Saiga 12, but I think early wipe you're only really going to be running the 5-round shotgun shell magazines. The 10-rounders require you to have 3x1 slots within your rig, which is kind of tricky, and the power mags are expensive, the big 20-round drubs, and again, they only fit into certain rigs. So it's kind of difficult to use. I think probably the MP153 is probably the best out of these shotguns. I've not used the MP155 extensively, and this can take some really crazy mods, which is sort of where the 5.5 comes in. I think the 153 is quite a decent contender early wipe as one of the best semi-auto shotguns. And the thing to note about this weapon is that if you want to grab a bigger magazine, you can actually grab the 133 magazine from Jaeger at this stage, and this does actually fit with very little ergonomic discount onto the 153. And so you can have 8 inside this magazine and 1 in the chamber itself to start with, which is actually pretty good to have 9 shells to begin with. It's actually alright. One thing to think about is that because these are on scavs all the time, you can get them usually quite cheaply on the flea market, sometimes a bit cheaper than this. These are going kind of for the trader price, which is a bit silly because these ones have got very damaged durability. So unless you're Jaeger 1, why would you bother buying these when you can buy this one? But if you can get it really cheaply, say half the price, then I think it might be worth buying a half damaged MP153 because I've hardly had any malfunctions on these at all. I'm sure some people in the comments will tell me otherwise, but I'm not sure if 100% durability really matters as much for a shotgun, to be honest, especially if you're not using slugs and if you're using buckshot instead. I find that they just very, very rarely malfunction anyway, and so the 50 durability thing just doesn't really make that much difference. Oh yes, and if you look on the flea market for the 155, they are actually a lot cheaper because they spawn on scouts more often. I just wanted to note that before we move on. Okay, so the final one here is the M700. I don't think this is really worth it. You have to have a beard oil to make it work. And people aren't really putting these up on the flea market under 30k. I'm not really using bolties, honestly. Again, this uses M80, but I don't know why you would use this weapon over the RFB. It fires the same rounds. The RFB is a little bit more expensive based on where beard oil is, but I just don't really use bolt actions that much. If I need to use one for a specific task, as I said before, I'll use the 215 from Jaeger, which is on Jaeger 1, which is this guy, because it's only 18k and it's very cheap. And yeah, it's an interesting one. I know some people really love the M700, and if you do, then be my guest. And if beard oil is going for these cheap prices, then it's great. Sometimes this just runs out. The market is quite thin at the moment, so it can rip up to 50, 60k, and then I guess you'll just have to consider it. But it's not one that I really use. So again, it's up to you. You can buy it if you want, but I'm probably not going to be touching this at this point in the wipe at all. So what are some other things to note? Well, Mechanic is going to be unlocked at level 20, but there's another big milestone, not actually to do with weapons, but when you get to Ragman level 2, this is at level 17, which I've just reached myself, you can then go and buy his 6B3TM rigs. These are always out of stock, so look for the cycle on it, but this effectively allows you to just continuously buy level 4 armor, which has become quite valuable this point because of all the high tier stuff going off the flea market, and they're quite expensive usually on the flea, going for, yeah, a good amount more, especially given that he's out of stock and he's only coming back in about 15 minutes. So you can buy them at the beginning, but it's not too bad. The other thing we're going to look at is the flea market. We're going to have a look at a few special mention weapons that aren't available on traders but could potentially be used for other reasons. So the first one that we're going to be looking at is the SA58. Now this is an interesting weapon just because it's so cheap. The main problem with this is it's actually very difficult to get a scope on it early, so you kind of want to use it as like a short range armor busting weapon. Something like the RFB is kind of tricky just because it's semi-auto, whereas this does have a full auto mode. You can buy 20 round magazines for it. I think it's a funny one to try and use, but it's a potential. If you want to bust people at point blank with M80, it could be quite effective, but the recoil is extremely high, so I'd just be a little bit careful with it, but it's one to bear in mind. Now, there's also an interesting thing with the DS Arms SA58, which is where people are listing them up on the flea market. You can actually disassemble them and sell them back to the trader at not insignificant prices. People don't necessarily realize that some of them are worth quite a decent amount. So like this one, for example, 66 out of 67. You buy this, you could probably sell it to Mechanic for actually more than what this person's listed it for, because these are actually pretty expensive when it comes to the flea market. So there, we can sell that back for 43k, make a small profit. But sometimes people post them up at prices that just don't really make sense, especially ones where they've got like a full magazine and stuff on them, and you can split a lot of the weapon parts off, especially if they don't sell to Mechanic. Split the weapons parts off and you can sell the lower back to fence, and then from there you can make a small profit. So just one to watch out for. I do want to make a note here that the MDR has been removed from the fleet. This is extremely sad because these would usually go for about 50,000 rubles. And this was kind of my go-to staple in the next period of the wipe. Once I could get M856A1 from Peacekeeper, after I got him up a bit, I'd use the MDR all the time. But now this is gone. This means we're going to have to think about some other things and use some of the other weapons that we've talked about today to try and make our lives a little bit easier in the patch. So I'm going to be thinking about what weapons are going to bridge us into the mid-game properly from the assault rifle perspective, and it's all going to come down to the ammo. The one that seems to have slipped through the net here, so the AK-103 is expensive-ish, like 43, 45k, something like that. And the AK-104 goes for quite a bit less. Now this is better ergonomics but worse recoil, and because it's a short version, I guess that's why people don't really like it too much. But given that it's slugging 762 PS, which is a decent round early game, and this is also coming from crates, you can see there's very few which are less than 100 durability. It's actually pretty good. It's quite compelling. You know, a lot of these ones, again, they're coming from crates, but they're 10k more. So if you want to pick up a fairly cheap weapon and you don't want to use the AKM itself, then you can use the AK-104, and for about the same price as the Tushonka trade, you can pick up this weapon which has decent ergo and maybe not that great recoil stats, but it's definitely a contender. Sticking with 762 just for a second, the AKmsn is actually another weapon in the same category. This never drops on scavs, and so all of these weapons are 100 as well. This can potentially be worth paying a little bit more for, because as we mentioned a long time ago in this video, there's a dovetail mount on this weapon in particular, similar to some others. So if you want to use one of those side mounting scopes like the PSO or something else with a rail that you can get cheaply for this, then you can get one of these weapons. And these are normally fairly expensive, the end versions. So if you look at the AKmn, this one goes up for sort of 74k. So if you don't really care about the stock too much and you're just going to put the butt pad on it, you can get a huge discount for not being able to replace the stock simply by buying one of these. If you want a shorty 545 weapon, then the AKS-74U is also very similar to what we've just talked about. So the AKS-74U, again, you can get it on the flea market for cheap or 24k. However, something like the UB or the UN, they don't drop on scavs either, and so people often put these up for 21,000 rubles, 20,000 rubles, and you can get a 100% durability version by buying either of these two rather than buying the classic, the AKS74U, because these ones are scav durability, and yes, you can buy it for Prapor for 24k, but these guys, why would you not buy one of these instead? It really doesn't matter. And the UN, again, because it has an N in the name, this also has a dovetail mount, which the classic one doesn't. And so this to go for 21,000 when the original one is going for 24,000 for 100% durability, this doesn't really make sense. You may as well get the one that has a little bit of a better feature on it. Why not? Two more final weapons to talk about. One potential is the RPK. These are pretty cheap. Again, 100% durability because they're coming from boxes. At 40,000, they're actually good. The base stats on this is decent, 63 and 71. So this is a contender. The only thing to bear in mind for the RPK is that it levels your machine gun stat, not your assault rifle stat. So it's not shared in terms of skills amongst all of the other weapons that you use, unfortunately, within the assault rifle category. And then finally, within the SMGs, one that we haven't talked about because we can't buy it yet technically within the traders is the APC Vector. Again, this comes from boxes, so it's 100% durability for people listening on the Flea. And this is on the expensive end, but sometimes these are going down to about 60,000 rubles, which for the 9x19 version is pretty decent, given that it comes with a stock of 32 vertical recoil, which is actually insane, and 74 ergonomics, which is great. I mean, this was kind of the star of the show last wipe, and yes, you're not going to be using it with the best ammo, but what you can do with this, which is different to the other version, is that when you're looking at magazines, you can buy the big stick round magazine from Skier 2 for 3,400 rubles. So 33 round mags for this gun is a lot better than running 13 round mags for the ACP version. And I think that this is definitely a contender. You can really use this weapon to get headshots in factory. I've been using it for that, and it's very, very good. It's not that expensive, given you just don't need to add anything. Maybe you add the vertical foregrip from Peacekeeper. He sells the grip, which is extremely cheap, which is this one. KC Knight's Armament Vertical, and that just gives 7 ergonomics. Given that you don't need to reduce the recoil on the Vector at all, you may as well just add some extra ergo because this is so incredibly cheap, and you're getting your money spent up with Peacekeeper as well. So I think that's the final one that is a potential goer. You just have to keep an eye out for the flea market as to when it's going cheaply, but I hope that this really helps you guys out there try to pick some weapons, because I know that when it opens out to the Flea and with the more traders, there's so many different choices. Just remember, it always comes down to the ammo. Think ammo first. What can I buy ammo related wise? And then let's look at the stats of the weapon itself and what it fires, and then think about those two in conjunction with each other and what kind of raid that you want to run. And it's very hard to go wrong from there. So as always, if you learned something, consider dropping a like and sub, because it helps with visibility for me. For people who haven't found me on YouTube yet, see when I'm streaming, you can follow me on Twitch and Twitter, where I'm currently live twice a week, once on Friday at 9 PM UK time for the ScavTalk podcast, which you definitely check out in the description if you want to, and a regular Tarkov stream on Saturday at 2 PM UK time. And with all that said, I'll see you next time, guys, and as always, have fun in your raids.